Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about some music history coming out of Bristol, Virginia / Tennessee. Bristol is a city that sits on the Tennessee and Virginia state border, and State Street divides the city in half on the state line. It's actually two separate cities, but it's just easier to say it's one city that sits on the state line. But as you may or may not know, Bristol is very important in the history of country music and in the history of American music in general. Bristol is known as the birthplace of country music because of a historic recording session that took place there in 1927. It all started in July of that year when a man named Ralph Peer held an audition at the Taylor Christian Glove and Hat Company in downtown State Street on the Tennessee side. Peer was a producer and a talent scout for the Victor Talking Machine Company, and they were in the business of making records. Peer had great success several years prior with artists such as Fiddlin' John Carson and Mamie Smith, and he was hoping to recreate that success with artists in southern Appalachia and cities across the South. Ralph Peer had previously worked with Ernest Pop Stoneman of the Stoneman Family Band in 1924, and he had a good feeling about the musicians in Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee. In July and August of 1927, Ralph Peer recorded artists such as the Carter Family from Macy Springs, Scott County, Virginia. A.P., Sarah, and Maybelle made the treacherous journey from Scott County to Bristol. Today it's a very scenic drive, but back then the roads were rough and they suffered a flat tire along the way. Also recorded was Jimmy Rogers from Meridian, Mississippi. Jimmy Rogers had been playing in the area for a few years with his band formed in Johnson City known as the Geneva Ramblers. Also recorded at the 1927 Bristol sessions was the legendary Henry Witter of Grayson County, Virginia. Henry Witter is known as a pioneer in country music today for being among the first country musicians to record a song with vocals. Also recorded at the Bristol sessions was B.F. Shelton, who recorded 4 songs, one of which was Pretty Polly, a murder ballad that would be made popular by Ralph Stanley decades later. Another musician recorded at the Bristol sessions was L. Watson, a Johnson City musician who played the bones and the harmonica. L. Watson was a well-known musician around Johnson City and was the only African American to record at the Bristol sessions. We'll talk more about him in another video. There were several other artists that recorded at the 1927 Bristol sessions that summer, but by far the biggest sellers were Jimmy Rogers and the Carter Family. Both acts went on to become country music's first superstars, but sadly Jimmy Rogers died a few years later of tuberculosis. The story of the Carter Family would go on to become legendary, and is a source of pride for many in southwestern Virginia. Their legacy is still preserved today at the Carter Family Fold in Hilton, Virginia. And although he died 6 years later, Jimmy Rogers' career is also very storied. He would even record with jazz legend Louis Armstrong before his death in 1933 at the age of 35. Jimmy Rogers' death, not Louis Armstrong. The following year in 1928, Ralph Peer held a second recording session in Bristol. This recording session was not as successful as the 1927 sessions, but it did preserve many traditional and original tunes from musicians in the region, such as Tarter and Gay, an African-American blues duo from Scott County, Virginia, the same county as the Carter Family. So that's a very condensed version of the 1927 and 1928 Bristol sessions. If you want to learn more about them, I would suggest checking out the book The Bristol Sessions by Charles K. Wolfe and Ted Olson. You can also check out the Birthplace of Country Music Museum in downtown Bristol. They sure would love to have you. So anyways, there's plenty more music history in Bristol where that came from. Bristol is the birthplace of a man named Clarence Tom Ashley, who recorded the first version of a song called The Cuckoo Bird. And he also recorded the first version of a song called House of the Rising Sun. Ever heard of it? But we'll talk more about Clarence Tom Ashley in the Johnson City episode. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, radio became very popular in America, and artists such as the Carter Family and Jimmy Rogers could now broadcast their music all across the country and weren't confined just to their local regions. A radio station named WCYB started in Bristol, and one of their most popular programs was a show called Farm and Fun Time. This is where the legendary Stanley brothers got their first big break, after moving to Bristol to be more centrally located to start their bluegrass career in the 1940s. In his autobiography, Man of Constant Sorrow, Ralph Stanley says that living in downtown Bristol was a whole lot different than living in the coal country of Dickinson County, Virginia. Farm and Fun Time was a popular show in Bristol and on WCYB, and continues to this day with Radio Bristol. Ralph also details a story in his autobiography about a time when his brother, Carter Stanley, got into a fist fight with another bluegrass picker, Lester Flatt, in front of WCYB studios in Bristol. Lester was upset with Ralph and Carter for playing traditional songs that he supposed was his on live radio. A heated argument quickly turned to blows, and the two pickers didn't speak for years. I like to think Carter won the fight, but who knows? Well, you're probably thinking to yourself, there's no way there's more country music history in Bristol, Tennessee/Virginia. Well, you're wrong. This next factoid involves one of the biggest country western music stars ever, Hank Williams Sr. Legend has it that Hank Williams Sr. was very sick in the back seat of his car driven by a taxi driver, and his taxi driver stopped at this burger bar in Bristol, Virginia for a bite to eat and some rest, and then switched drivers with another taxi driver. When that driver got to Oak Hill, West Virginia, he realized that Hank Williams was dead in the back seat. More than likely, Hank Williams was already dead by the time they visited this burger bar, but the story lives on as part of Bristol's music lore. Another tidbit about Bristol is that there's a slight shout-out to Bristol in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The soundtrack features Ralph Stanley heavily, as well as other musicians such as Emmylou Harris and Chris Thomas King, who have been known to play in the Bristol region. There's also a Jimmy Rogers song on the soundtrack. But my favorite part is when this guy says that he can
depart from Bristol
in 2 weeks. Another Bristol native and national treasure is Tennessee Ernie Ford, who had the famous song 16 Tons and a radio show in Bristol in the 1950s. He eventually became a household name in America and played in 3 episodes of I Love Lucy. Well, that's about all the Bristol music history that I have for you. Like I said, if you want to know more, you can check out the Birthplace of Country Music Museum in downtown Bristol, or you can check out their website. One of my favorite things about Bristol is its dedication to music and its music history. Every year, the Bristol Rhythm and Roots Reunion pays homage to the deep musical roots that run through Bristol. For a lot of us locals, it's considered the most wonderful time of the year. Stay tuned because this is the first in a 3-part series about music in the Tri-Cities, Bristol, Kingsport, and Johnson City, Tennessee. So thanks again for watching, and if you like what you saw, tell your friends. And I'll see you next video.